Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, this past Sunday, Mr. Cummings, ranking member on the Oversight Committee, said based on everything he's seen regarding the IRS case, based on everything he's seen, the case is solved. Is Mr. Cummings accurate in his assessment?
Could you repeat that if you would?
Based on everything I've seen, quoting Mr. Cummings, the case is solved. This is regarding the IRS scandal.
Which case?
The IRS scandal.
The IRS case?
Yeah.
You know, the IRS case is currently under investigation, and basically it's just started.
Yeah. What can you tell us? I mean, you started a month ago. What can you tell us about this? Have you found have you found the now infamous 2 rogue agents? Have you discovered who those people are?
Needless to say, because it's under investigation, I can't give out any of the details.
Can you tell me some basics? Can you tell me how many agents, investigators you've assigned to the case?
May be able to do that, but I'd have to get back to you.
Can you tell me who the lead investigator is?
Off the top of my head, no.
This is the most important issue in front of the country the last 6 weeks. You don't know who's heading up the case? Who the lead investigator is?
At this juncture, no, I do not know who the.
Can you get that information to us? We'd like to know. We'd like to know how many people you've assigned to look into this situation.
I have not had a recent briefing on it. I had a briefing on it when we first initiated it, but I have not had a recent briefing as to where we are.
So you don't know who's leading the case?
I do not know who is the lead agent.
Do you know if you've talked to any of the victims? Have you talked to any of the groups who were targeted by their government? Have you met with any of the Tea Party folks since May 14, 2013?
I don't know what the status of the interviews are by the team that's on it.
Would you expect that that's been done?
Certainly at some point in time in the course of the investigation will be done, but generally at the outset of the investigation you get the documents so that you can have a real.
But don't you normally talk to the victims?
I do not know specifically what is happening.
In your extensive record and history and investigative work, don't you typically talk to the victim? It's a criminal investigation. Don't you typically talk to the victims pretty soon?
I'm sure it will happen.
So did the FBI contact any of these same victims? Were they contacted by the FBI prior to the investigation when these same groups were applying for tax-exempt status? Did the FBI pay some of these individuals a visit?
I do not know.
Pardon?
I do not know.
You don't know?
I do not know.
Some of them testified that they were paid a visit by the FBI. Specifically, Catherine Engelbrecht in Texas said she was visited by the FBI. She was head of True the Vote. Is that true or not?
Do not know.
You do not know. Okay. If the FBI did contact people involved in the IRS scandal, victims groups, prior to the investigation when they were applying for tax-exempt status, why was that the case? Why would you be looking into it? And was there possibly coordination with the IRS in why you targeted them?
You're asking me details about the investigation. I'd be happy to get back.
I'm not asking you details about the investigation. I'm saying why were people targeted before the investigation started? Why were they contacted by the FBI? People who are now part of Tea Party groups who were targeted by the IRS.
You're asking questions about details of the investigation. I'd be happy to take
that. Is not a detail about the investigation. That took place prior to the investigation started.
May I please finish? You're asking detailed questions about the investigation. I'd be happy to get back to you and answer those questions that I can, understanding.
I'm asking basic questions about the investigation, like who's heading it up, and you can't tell me that. Can you get back to me on any group who was targeted by the IRS who the FBI visited with prior to the investigation starting, while they were applying for tax? That would be important information for this committee to have. Can you get that to me?
We'll look at the questions and try to respond.
Have you reviewed the Inspector General's report regarding the IRS scandal?
I have been through it, yes.
Do you have any concerns about the way the Inspector General did the report and collected information?
I did not focus on that at all. I was looking.
Well, let me ask you a couple things. Is it typically appropriate for the investigator to have one of the central players in this, Ms. Holly Paz, who was director of one of the key players at the tax exempt division, set in on all the interviews, almost all the interviews with employees in that division? Is that typically how an investigation is done?
I'm not familiar with those circumstances. I understand what you're saying about those circumstances, so not being familiar with it, I can't.
In your time as an investigator, is that how you would do interviews with the boss sitting next to the person you're trying to get information from?
Well, again,
Is it appropriate for Holly, the Inspector General came out in a transcribed interview that our staff has done, the Oversight Committee staff has done, is it appropriate to have her collect the data and give it to the Inspector General?
I am not familiar with the.
If that happened, is that appropriate?
I'm not going to speculate.
Let me ask one last thing, because this did happen. Mr. Chairman, last question. So, is it appropriate when the Inspector General is doing his investigation, doing his audit, to give information to the very people he's investigating in the course of the investigation and not share that same information with the Oversight Committee. Specifically, May 30th of last year, the Inspector General told Doug Shulman that the terms Tea Party, Patriot, 912 were used to identify groups and put them on a list. He told them that was going on at the IRS. He told them that a year ago. 4 days later, he told the General Counsel at Treasury, Chris Meade, the same information, but did not share that with the committee who asked for the investigation. The committee who has oversight over the Inspector Generals and all federal agencies did not share that information with us. Is that typically how an investigation is supposed to work?
Again, you're talking about circumstances with which I am not familiar. Each investigation is a little bit different, and I really can't comment on what was appropriate in that particular investigation without knowing and sitting down and going through the facts.
But that's, if I could, Mr. Chairman, and I will stop. That's the point. You've had a month now to investigate. This has been the biggest story in the country, and you can't even tell me who the lead investigator is? You can't tell me that actions the Inspector General took, which are not typically how investigations are done, you can't tell me if that's appropriate or not? This is not speculation. This is what happened, and you can't tell me how many agents are assigned to the most important news story, maybe the most important.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The director will be allowed to answer the question, and if he can't answer it today, we would definitely expect that he answer it in writing to us as promptly as possible.
I'd be happy to take your questions in writing, sir.
I think so.
The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Delbaney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Director, for your service and for being with us here today. I happen to agree with those who believe that greater transparency and better data about the requests that government entities are making to Internet companies and providers will help inform the discussion that we're having about how to balance legitimate national security needs with privacy rights. I understand it was referred to a little bit earlier that Google sent a letter to you and Attorney General Holder earlier this week requesting that it be permitted to provide reports of the number of FISA national security requests it receives as well as their scope. And I wondered if you could share with us what your response is to that request.
I think that's being looked at by Justice at this point.
Okay. Then earlier this year, Google did work with the Department of Justice and the FBI to disclose in broad strokes the number of national security letters that Google receives. And did Google's disclosures of these numbers harm national security in any way?
Well, let me just hypothesize without answering particularly. If you had such figures out there, would not somebody who wanted to have secure communications maybe make some decisions as a result of that information as to what, what communications capability they use? So it's basically there are issues that need to be discussed in the course of deciding what needs to be declassified. I think most of us in the government would love to be able to disclose more because it would be more understandable to persons, but you have the conflicting values of trying to protect the country and trying to protect that information that enables us to continuously identify and to intercept the communications of terrorists in an effort to thwart attacks. That's the conflict.
Thank you. The committee is currently also considering reform of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. And as you may know, the Senate Judiciary Committee recently reported reform legislation out of committee. Members on both sides of the aisle seem to agree that we failed to modernize our law to align with reasonable expectations of privacy, especially in the digital age. For routine criminal investigations, I believe law enforcement should use the same standard to search your inbox that they do to search files and letters in your home. But our current outdated law allows police to provide only a subpoena issued without a judge's approval to force service providers to turn over emails that have been opened or are more than 6 months old. The committee is currently considering legislation that would require government entities to obtain a warrant before having access to stored content. And I'm pleased that the Department of Justice and Attorney General Holder recently acknowledged that reform to the Electronic Communications Privacy Act has failed to keep up with the development of technology. And I wanted to know if you agree agree that it's time to reform these laws to include a warrant standard for stored content?
Well, I would agree that it's time to relook at these laws, given the communications, in terms of what the impact on it would have on particular requirements in particular situations. I would wait to see what kind of legislation is proposed.
Do you have a proposal of what kind right now? If I have a physical letter, a piece of paper in my home, you need a warrant. If I have an online piece of communication, it doesn't necessarily have the same standard.
We'd be pleased to get back to you either by regular letter or by email.
And in terms of broader reform, in terms of keeping up, do you have recommendations on other reforms you think that we need to look at? Because the way that folks have communicate now is very different than the past. You talked about chat and other forms. Clearly, our laws have not kept up with the changes in technology. And do you have an opinion or ideas of how you'd like to see legislation formed there?
Yeah, we'll get back to you on that with whatever ideas we have. I do think there needs to be reform. There is always an impetus to increase the standards to get particular documents, but it should be done, in my mind, dependent on the attributes of privacy that are necessary for a particular means of communication or a particular piece of data relating to communications. If you raise the standard too high, we then do not get the basic information that can identify terrorists to the point where then we could take the additional investigative steps. Identify the subscriber. Once we've identified the subscriber, identify others in that network. If we, as a result of that predicated level of investigation, find that they are involved in terrorism, then getting a wiretap. We tend to confuse that which is covered by the Fourth Amendment, that which is not covered by the Fourth Amendment. And so as one drafts the legislation, my belief is that ought to be kept in mind.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Chair, thanks.